When it comes to electric cars, each of the last couple of years saw some element of concern about the prospects of a cloudy outlook for the year for electric car sales. As we went into 2021, the first year of the global pandemic, after the first year of the global pandemic, there was a worry whether the subsidy schemes that had been implemented over the course of 2020 to boost electric car sales would actually be sustained, because they helped bring electric car sales to new records. But they were. And so electric car sales grew strongly over the course of 2021 to reach 6.6 million electric cars being sold in that year. As we moved into 2022, there was a discussion focusing on these uncertainties around potential supply chain disruptions, the macroeconomic and geopolitical uncertainty, as well as high commodity and energy prices and what they might actually mean. But by the end of the year, we saw electric car sales reaching over 10 million cars being sold in that year. As we went into last year, into 2023, there was speculation that sales in China in the year before may have been inflated in anticipation of the phase-out of incentive scheme by the end of 2022. But again, by the end of 2023, we observed that electric car sales had increased even further to reach nearly 14 million cars that were sold, 35% higher than in the year before. And China, the country that was being discussed at the time, had accounted for around 60% of global sales. Now, it shouldn't be surprising that as we go into this year, there is again a lot of discussion, this time focusing very much about concerns that we are seeing in monthly market trends. And of course, there is truth to that discussion here as we look at all three major car markets. In China, electric car sales actually fell in February year on year, but this was this year, the month of Chinese New Year. Over the entire first quarter, sales in China were up 35% year on year. In the United States, the sales share of pure electric battery cars actually declined over the first quarter, but this was compensated somewhat by a growth in the share of plug-in hybrids, and overall sales grew by almost 15% year on year in the United States relative to the first quarter of last year. And finally, in Europe, electric car sales dropped in March in key markets like Germany, where the subsidies were actually phased out, but also in Italy. But it's worth noting here that the overall car market was also sluggish. The share of electric cars in total car sales in March was actually pretty similar to last year. And over the entire first quarter, electric car sales in Europe grew 8% year on year. Globally, what we have seen is that electric car sales, as our executive director already mentioned, were up one quarter compared to the sales in the first quarter of 2023, which we think is a very healthy growth despite the observed challenges that we saw. Around 3 million electric cars were sold over the entire first quarter globally, which is equivalent to the total electric car sales over the course of the entire year 2020. Now, we cannot say for certain, of course, how this year will develop. And as every year, there are reasons to be concerned in some car markets, such as Europe, for example. But given the trends that we have observed, we expect this year to be another strong year for electric car markets. Our current expectation is for electric car sales to increase to around 17 million over the entire 2024. And as a result of this growth, we estimate that electric car sales could account for more than 20% of car sales this year, up from 18% last year. In the three largest global car markets, electric car sales are going to be increasingly widespread. In particular, as the executive director already mentioned, we are expecting electric car sales in China to account for around 45% of all cars being sold this year. We actually saw China electric car sales already reaching or exceeding the 40% share over the course of March. The boost in electric car markets and sales has the potential to significantly change the global car industry. When you look at all conventional cars that were sold globally last year, then only around 10% were produced by companies that have their headquarters in China. The rest, as you can see here, comes from car makers in other countries, in particular Europe, Japan, of course, but also United States, Korea, and a couple of other countries. The electric car industry, however, looks very, very different. Of the 14 million electric cars that were sold globally last year, more than half were actually produced by Chinese companies. Now, China electric car sales are higher than those in Europe and the United States. And so it is, of course, understandable why Chinese companies have a lead here. And the strong competition among manufacturers in China could mean that the industry has some challenging times ahead of it over the coming years. But it is important to take note of the starting points of the different parts of the car industry when it comes to the transition to electric cars. Now, electric car manufacturers will, of course, seek to expand their reach to other car markets, including in emerging and developing economies where overall car ownership today is still very low, and so there is a significant market potential both for internal combustion engine vehicles as well as for electric cars. The good news for the electric car industry is that sales increased significantly last year in several of the emerging markets. In India, for example, electric car sales were up 70% year on year, reaching a sales share of around 2%, the start of an industry. In Vietnam, overall car markets contracted actually last year by around 1/4, whereas electric car sales recorded an unprecedented growth, accounting for 15% of total sales. And in Thailand, electric car sales more than quadrupled year on year, and the sales share of electric cars reached an impressive 10%, very similar to the share we have seen in the United States. In other countries, such as Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, we still see much lower shares, but increasing sales, of course. When we're investigating these type of trends a bit more closely, we see two different stories that are emerging. The first story is one on which local car makers are emerging as leading companies. This is particularly true in India, for example, where around 80% of all electric car sales since 2010 came from Tata and Mahindra, which are two domestic producers. In Vietnam, the domestic producer VinFast was established in 2017 and now accounts for nearly all electric car sales in the country. The second story, though, is one in which the arrival of Chinese car makers has helped jumpstart electric car sales. In Thailand, for example, Chinese car makers accounted for around 3/4 of electric car sales last year. When Hozon, a famous Chinese car maker, launched the Neta V model 2 years ago, it became a bestseller because it was cheaper than other electric car models and started to be competitive with conventional cars. Very similar in Indonesia, where Wuling, another Chinese car maker which produces one of the cheapest Chinese EVs, launched the Air EV less than 2 years ago. This became a great success as well. Chinese car makers accounted for 60% of electric car sales in Indonesia on average over the last 2 years. And again, very similar observations here for Brazil and Mexico. So China's electric car market and its electric car industry are hugely significant for global trends. It is therefore worth looking in more depth at how some of the key indicators have been developing in China over the last few years to understand better what are the potential global implications. One of the main reasons why we see such strong growth in China is because electric cars are getting more and more affordable. In 2018, our estimate is that before any purchase subsidy, around 10% of the electric cars that were sold in China were cheaper than their average conventional equivalent. For last year, our estimate is that this number has jumped to over 60%, which is very important. Electric cars need to become cheaper to be able to compete with their conventional counterparts and reach mass markets, much as solar PV has successfully done it in the power sector. And in China, prices have fallen to an extent that this is increasingly the case. It's unlike the situation in Europe and the United States, where electric cars are generally still more expensive, and so it is challenging to forecast a specific year if and when electric cars might break even on prices with conventional ones, but we can reasonably expect that an increasing number of electric cars will compete on prices in the next couple of years. It is very important here also to note that this idea of price competitiveness comes despite the trend that electric cars are increasingly, the sales are increasingly dominated by SUVs. Just as for conventional cars, electric cars in China are also getting larger. Back in 2018, over 40% of electric car sales in China were small cars, and these were the first to be cheaper than their conventional equivalents, of course. But over the last 5 years, we have seen considerable price declines in electric SUVs. Many models have become competitive on prices with conventional SUVs, and so SUVs, electric SUVs, now account for nearly 40% of electric car sales. An important reason, other than pricing strategies of car manufacturers, for why Chinese electric cars are getting cheaper is because of changes in battery chemistries. In 2018, less than 20% of electric cars sold in China were using so-called lithium iron phosphate LFP batteries. In 2023, this number jumped to nearly 2/3. Chinese LFP batteries are significantly cheaper to produce than other mainstream lithium-ion chemistries, and so the LFP strategy has paid off in China in two ways. It helped bring down the prices for electric cars, and it cuts back the demand for critical minerals. Now, falling prices for electric cars are obviously very important for electric cars to be able to reach mass markets. But building consumer confidence and comfort requires more than that. It requires the development of an adequate public charging infrastructure. Today, most charging takes place at home or at the workplace. Our estimate is that there are almost 10 times as many private chargers as there are public ones. Many governments are strengthening public support for public charging, but the rollout so far has been very different by country. The first story is one where the rollout of public charging infrastructure has not kept pace with the electric car sales, such as, for example, in Norway, United Kingdom, or the United States. In these countries, the number of electric cars per public charging point has actually increased over time from roughly 10 to 15 in the year 2015 to 25 to 35 per public charging point more recently. Important to remember that electric car sales grew very strongly in these countries nonetheless, simply because most electric car owners have access to private charging, 80% in Norway and the United States, 90% in the UK. But to enable mass market adoption, we will need more public charging points. Many consumers are unlikely to have access to private charging at home. Now, this is one story of charging infrastructure. The other one is in China, which is very, very different. As in other countries, also like Korea, for example, where most electric car drivers are living in densely populated cities, public charging is much more prevalent. In China, despite this enormous growth in electric car sales, the number of public charging points per electric cars has actually remained somewhat constant over the last couple of years. As the Executive Director already mentioned, despite the challenges that we are seeing in some markets, our outlook to 2030 and 2035 remains a very positive one on the back of underlying market trends, but also supportive policy and industry actions. This will have implications for the car industry as well as for energy markets.